Hi everybody, and welcome to today's lecture on gender and queer theory. This is also another school of criticism that I particularly like because I believe it's quite relevant to things we are concerned about socially and personally today. But also it's a very thorough school of thought. There's a lot of things to consider in this theory, a lot of big questions, so to speak. So, if you find this particularly interesting, there are no doubt a lot of things for you to consider in the novel. Excuse me. So, again, the big ideas. What is this school of criticism all about? Well, naturally, given the title of it, we're interested in exploring issues of sexuality, power, and marginalization in literature and in culture. This theory is influenced, in part by feminist theory because that's also a school of thought that's quite interested in how populations are marginalized or disenfranchised or made weaker by social institutions. So you might find some intersection there. And of course, given the name as well, the primary concern is how gender and sexuality are being addressed, being discussed, reinforced, challenged in literature. People who subscribe to this particular school of thought are interested in the breakdown of binaries such as male and female, cultural definitions of sexuality and what it means to be male or to be female, to be a man, to be a woman, is constantly in flux. And so these types of scholars are very interested in how these ideas can be broken down to their essentials and how we can blur the lines in between the two of them. And of course, as a society, as a world, as a scientific community, as we learn more about biology and genetic structure, these ideas of what male and what female is becomes even murkier and more complex. Of course, genetic syndromes in which you may have double X and a Y, intersexuality, and sexual dimorphisms can challenge these preconceived notions. As we can understand, nature isn't so neat and tidy as we would imagine it could or should be. So there are bound to be exceptions to these rules. And we know now, more than we have, that gender and sexuality can exist on a spectrum. So it isn't ever really just a black and white thing. And of course, key questions. So if you find yourself curious about these types of things, then this might be the type of approach you want to take to the novel. Of course, what elements of the text, and that can mean characters, interactions, relationships, even to an extent, setting, which would be kind of interesting to do, but you could attempt that. How can we interpret parts of the text to be masculine? What that could mean is powerful or active or having agency. And how can we interpret parts of the text to be feminine, where it's perhaps marginalized or more passive? How do characters support and challenge these roles? Is an important thing to consider. What support, if any, might be an option here too, none at all, is given to elements or characters who question these binaries. What happens to characters who do? Are they ostracized? Are they accepted? Are they discounted as just being quirky or going through a phase? Pay attention to Sally Seton in this story if you're particularly interested in how that happens. And of course, Clarissa Dalloway would be an interesting accompaniment to that as well. What elements in the text, of course, exist outside of this binary? What elements may exhibit traits of both of them? What other bisexualities present that we can explore? How does this work contribute to our knowledge of queer experience and history, including literary history of queer experience, queer writers, um, queer interpretation, all of these things can fit into how a work can expand our understanding of that. And how is queerness being addressed and challenged or enforced by the text, of course? It's something to be ashamed of, something to be repentant of, or do characters embrace queerness or encourage it? Maybe not encourage, but view it in a not negative light. My English is working very great today. Of course, how is queer experience being coded in these texts? Something to consider without going into a whole lot of details, because I don't want to emphasize that Virginia Woolf's life is the cause of everything in her texts, but Virginia Woolf is known to have engaged in both relationships with men and with women. So if you read anything about Virginia Woolf, I'm sure you'll hear something about Vita Sackville West, who was a very important woman in her life, and the two were very intimate with one another for several years. So perhaps how is her experience as, and of course terms that we use today aren't always the best fit for the lives of those who lived 100 years ago. I hate to say Virginia Woolf's bisexual, but how does her experience with both genders maybe influence her writing of queer experience or queer characters in her texts? And you'll see that in Mrs. Dalloway. Another question to consider is, what does the work reveal about the operations of homophobia? How does homophobia work socially, politically, psychologically in a text? What can we take away from that as an institution that rejects or opposes or resists queerness? And there are a bunch more questions here too on the next page I have for you. How does the text illustrate the problems of sexuality and sexual identity? That is, of course, the ways in which human sexuality isn't neat, and you can't just put it into all sorts of boxes. It's not as simple as homosexual and heterosexual. Does the text embrace that human sexuality and sexual identity is messy, is complicated? And I think you might find that Mrs. Dalloway engages with that a little bit. How, of course, are sexual identity and sex acts being socially constructed? What I mean by that is how our society functions and how we're raised often influences what we view perhaps as appropriate or what we view in general as a sexual identity or as a sex act. So how are those different across social boundaries? How are the definitions of these ideas unique per cultures? How do individuals embrace or reject this can be either apparent, this can be subtle, their sexual preferences or their gender identity? That's something you can pay attention to in the story as well if you're interested in this. And of course, gender and queer theory does take interest in HIV and AIDS. So more specifically is how, is the status of the subject or the person treated in the biomedical discourse or the conversation that involves them? How does the medical community treat these people that are involved in this type of epidemic, right? How does that intersect? So one thing people may look at is, of course, the shift of sex education to emphasize sexual practices or abstinence over educating people about sexual identity. Also, the misrecognition of HIV or AIDS as a gay disease or exclusively homosexual, or that homosexuality in general is some kind of fatality or flaw or will lead to your death. So these are some general questions to consider that may not be so relevant in Mrs. Dalloway, but are things to consider in this school of criticism. And of course, additional reading, I have the link to the Purdue Owl. And the Purdue Owl, these pages, these links I'm providing you, do supply you with reading lists for things that they cite in their own article that you may want to look at. I also found a essentially, I would say, a queer theory reading of The Kiss in Mrs. Dalloway. So this is an article, of course, you are free to use if you'd like, if you think that will fit in your argument, if this is where you want to go. Feel free to look that up and read some of that if you're curious to see how a queer theorist, gender theorist would tackle maybe a particular scene in Mrs. Dalloway and how you too could focus on a particular moment, an interaction, or a scene over the course of an entire paper. So that concludes today's lecture on gender and queer theory, and we will see you, or rather, you'll hear me, in the next one. Have a good day.